this video, we're going to stop our discussion of C# for today and turn our attention to the power of the IDE. So remember that every day what we want to do is introduce a little new concept from the Visual C# 2010 Express Edition IDE. And today we're going to focus on the debugging features, which allows us to step through code execution and peek inside and look at some of the hidden values inside of variables and so forth. It'll help us to debug and find problems with our application, and it helps us to kind of see how code execution works, especially when we get into some more advanced examples where we're calling methods and jumping around the code a little bit more. So this is a first step in that direction. So the first thing that we want to talk about is setting a breakpoint. There's a couple of ways to do that, and a breakpoint is simply this. It's a stop sign for the execution of your application. Remember that in debug mode, a debug version of your assembly is created with a bunch of bookmarks, and those bookmarks help the IDE catch up to the execution of the assembly so that when you execute one line of code in the assembly, it will find the corresponding line of code in C# and display that on the screen, and we're going to watch that happen today. It's pretty cool stuff. All right, so what I want to do is just set my cursor on a given line of code. We're using the previous video's example because there's lots of good looping and so forth that we can take advantage of. We're just going to set our cursor on one of the lines of code, and I think we can go up to debug and just say, I want to toggle a breakpoint, or you can hit F9 on your keyboard, and notice what it does. It puts a little red ball in the leftmost column of the IDE and then highlights the entire line of code in red. So visually I can see that, hey, I got a breakpoint set here. If I wanted to temporarily disable this breakpoint, I could hit F9 again, or I could just right click it and select breakpoint, delete breakpoint. That removes it completely. If I wanted to use the breakpoint again, I can either go to the debug menu, or I can just click right here in the column on the left hand side. That's the technique I use. It's easy. Just click in the little left hand column and I can turn it on, turn it off. Now what if I wanted to temporarily disable that? I could right click and go to breakpoint, disable breakpoint, and so it's not in use right now, but I can easily add and remove that breakpoint back and forth in order to isolate a problem or get to that line of code that I want to get to. It's a visual reminder that I had a breakpoint here at some point, and oh yeah, that's right, I wanted to check on this. So useful in that regard. So let's just go ahead and click it again, and it re-enables the breakpoint. All right, so enough about breakpoints. Let's see it in action. Let's run our application by hitting Start Debugging, or I can hit F5 on my keyboard. And notice that for a brief second, we saw the console window pop up, so the application started. And since we have this on the first line of code, we popped almost immediately into our debugger. And so we are now in debug mode. And notice that the IDE has changed visually. First of all, we see a new panel below the code area. And there's a couple of windows. There's a locals window and a watch window. We'll come back to those in a moment. There's also something called an immediate window and a call stack. We'll talk about those in a moment as well. All right, now to step through the code, you have a couple of options. You can use this step into, step over, and step out. For right now, I'm just going to recommend we use step over. At a later date, when we're dealing with more intricate code that involves methods calling methods, then we'll use the step into and step out of. But for right now, all we need is the step over button. It's the one in the middle. And I'm going to just click it one time. Also, I think you can use F10 on the keyboard. Let's take a look at the debug menu. I never do this. Yeah, step over is F10. Or you can step into F11 or shift F11 to step out. So F10, or you can use this button here in the middle. And you can see now I'm stepping through, and you can see in yellow how each section of code is highlighted as it's being executed. Pretty neat, huh? So now the iterator fires, and we're still checking to make sure that I is less than the length of the numbers, which we talked about in the previous video. And we're just continuing to increment I and then checking again. And so that's pretty neat, right? So let me draw your attention to a couple of other additional things. You can view the values of your variables by just hovering over. For example, I'm hovering over I, and you can see the value of I is 2. I can hover over the current value of numbers, and since it kind of evaluates numbers with regard to the current value of I can see that the value is the value 5. Or actually, oh, it doesn't give me that. But if I drill down into it, now I can see the value of all of the variables. That's kind of neat. Now, look at this. Did you see the little pin off to the right-hand side? Let me see if I can get over there. I'm just going to pin that down, and now to the right-hand side, I can see the value of I as it changes. So now it changed to 3. Notice when it changed to 3 that it turned to a red color. Now, the next time we run this line of code, it'll turn back because nothing changed with that line of execution. Okay, so I can get rid of this little window, I can unpin it, or I can expand it to see additional information, and I can even type in a comment here. Type in a comment here to remind myself why I even had that little window open, or what it represents, or what something I need to get back to. This is all fantastic stuff, and that's a feature I think in Visual Studio 2010. It wasn't in 2008, so pretty neat stuff. Now the other thing is this little locals window. Here you can see the value of all of the items that are within the context of the current area of execution. We haven't talked about scope of variables just yet, but everything that's within scope, every variable and every value that currently will find its meaning in this block of code that we're working with is represented in the locals window for easy reference. So I can see easily here that the value of I is 3, and I can expand that numbers array to see the value of each of the elements of that array. You can see that names in my text and char array, which we haven't executed yet because they're further down in the line of code, those values are null. So again, that null we haven't really talked about. Null means an empty value, an unknown value. And right now, since we haven't hit those lines of code, we know that names in my text and char array will be identifiers, variables within our block of code. They just have not been assigned a value yet, so their value is unknown. It's null. Okay. All right. So let's continue on executing our line of code. Now, what we could do is just step over and continue to step through this. What I'd like to do is this. I'm going to set a new breakpoint on another line of code. Yeah, I'm in debug mode, but I can still set additional breakpoints. And then just to show you, we can continue to execute the application so we don't have to keep stepping through it. We can just say, all right, spin through all of the for loops, roll through the strings, and then when you get to this for each, stop and let me take over again. So we're going to hit the continue button, and we hit the for each statement. And so now, we can continue on with our stepping over of the lines of code. Now, if we look down at our locals window, names has taken on values. They've been hydrated. Notice that there's this little textual visualizer, especially if you have a lot of text. This is a helpful way to see all of it in one window because, as you can see, it wouldn't all fit in this little grid style display as it's represented here. What else can I show you about this? Let's see. Oh yeah, the watch window. Say for example there was a particular variable that we wanted to see. I don't want to look through all the locals window. I'm really only interested in one specific value. For example, name. Now what I can do is just highlight name. I double clicked on that identifier, and then I'm going to drag and drop it into the watch window. And when I do that, see, now I can just isolate only those variables or identifiers that I'm most interested in. So as I move through this, I'm watching the watch window only for the value of name. And you can see as it changes, it turns to red and then clears out. pretty awesome. Now notice when I went outside of the context of the for each loop, it gives me this option to refresh. However, since we're outside of the scope of this block of code, and we haven't talked about scope yet, but since we're outside of it, now the value is indeterminate. And I can hit the refresh button to the right hand side, but it says the name doesn't exist in the current context. Again, we'll need to talk about scope at a later date. Okay, so and then just to continue on, I think that's pretty much all that I really wanted to talk about here. But it's fascinating and fun to watch your applications execute, at least at first. It helps you understand. Let's say, for example, that on your first programming job, somebody says, okay, I need you to do some code maintenance. Code maintenance isn't really all that fun. It's more fun to develop applications from scratch because you're the one making the mess instead of cleaning up somebody else's mess. I guess that's kind of a pessimistic way to look at it. But probably the first thing you want to do is set a breakpoint in the first line of code and walk through it and watch it execute and to come to a better understanding of how the application works. That is a very practical use of the debugging features within .NET. Another one is finding your own bugs, something you just have a hard time identifying. Why is it behaving this way? And you say, oh, it's behaving this way because on that line of code, it does whatever. Okay, so there are some additional features of debugging that I'm going to have to wait before I can really demonstrate. Frankly, we're going to need some more complex code before we can use them. But that's okay. Again, our goal is to build on our knowledge a little bit day by day, and today you've taken a big step in solving your own problems using the Visual Studio IDE and the debugging features. Okay, so I think that wraps it up for all of the content for today's lesson. It was a longer day than yesterday. Now we're going to work on the homework assignment, and hopefully you've been paying attention through the videos because you're going to need that information. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you.